Concerns over far-right extremism are growing here in the U.S. and around the world. According to the Washington Post, far-right extremists are now using more sophisticated methods, including pop culture, to recruit new members. Marc Fisher wrote that piece and joins me now. He is a senior editor for the Washington Post. Marc, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. You know, it's really interesting to read about these tactics because I'm not sure we've really seen this before or heard much about it before. And I suppose technology has a lot to do with it. I know that's what you spelled out in your piece. But what are some of the tactics that these extremists now use to just approach people, first of all? And how has this trend of recruitment changed over the years?
Well, the big change, as you mentioned, has been technology. And what we've seen is that what used to be fringe movements in our country on the extremes of the political spectrum have moved into the mainstream because they were able to find a broader audience online, particularly in social media, particularly in chat groups and gaming platforms. And what happens is that the members of these far-right extremist groups will hang out in places where they know that people are lonely, where people are searching for community, and they'll look for people who might have some political views, perhaps express themselves with politically incorrect humor, with memes that are funny, and they'll connect with those folks. They'll approach those folks and say, if you like that, maybe you'll like this. And they'll send them some funny memes, and they'll send them some jokes about particular ethnic groups, for example, and they'll sort of test them and see if they're open to a very kind of blaming sort of a message, blaming the other, blaming immigrants, blaming Jews, blaming blacks. And so it moves from fairly mainstream conservative positions to extreme sorts of racism.
But Marc, you know, it's interesting because you point out in your piece that the ideology here is not necessarily consistent. So what is common among these recruits? What keeps them together?
It's really all about community, and it's, for lack of a better term, it's about fun. What happens is that these are people who are lonely, especially over these last 15, 16 months in the COVID pandemic. More and more people feeling socially isolated, not being politically extreme at all, and yet there they are online looking for camaraderie, looking for people they can connect with. And these far-right extremists take advantage of that. They approach people who are expressing loneliness. They hang out on chat rooms for the lonely, for the depressed, for people with mental illness, and for people with autism. So they look for people who might be feeling a little bit lost, a little bit isolated, and then they approach them with genuine friendship, with empathy, and then only later, sometimes weeks or months later, do they start to sprinkle in some of the more extreme politics. So as you're right, it's not about ideology to begin with, it's really about community. This is a tried and tested way of drawing people in. In fact, many of the far-right extremists picked this up from Islamic jihadists who perfected this method in their efforts to recruit people online.
Well, you spoke to the founder of one of the first white nationalist sites on the internet. What did he say about former President Trump's role in spreading their message?
It's Don Black, who's the founder of Stormfront, which was one of the first neo-Nazi groups to go online years ago. And what he said is that he is grateful to former President Trump because Trump brought some of these far-right ideas into the mainstream, not by endorsing white supremacism by any means, but rather by giving people who are extremists permission to sort of speak to a much larger audience of Trump voters, Republicans, conservatives, who might have rejected out of hand any extremist message. But after the president at Charlottesville and in some of his rallies made statements about excluding Muslims, made statements about how some of the people in the Charlottesville protests were maybe not so bad. These right-wing extremists say that helped them by giving them entree to a much broader array of people, some of whom might come along with their far-right and racist ideas.
So, you know, I wonder if there's sort of a takeaway here, because I think after January 6th, so many Americans were trying to seek some understanding of how it is their fellow citizens could feel so deeply as to behave in that way. And so the question is, how is it that society can offer more of these opportunities for, as you say, community or belonging to young people in particular who may be more vulnerable to some of these kinds of tactics, who are being misled by some of this extremist content? Because, you know, it's interesting, Mark, I think at one point you had a quote from someone who said, quote, "But members say they got in because there were people who were being nice to me."
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, loneliness doesn't know any one brand of politics or another. It's a common affliction for all Americans, especially during this last year. And so what happens is when people do get sucked into extreme political views as a way of making connections and finding themselves a community, it becomes ever harder to get them back out. And I talked to a number of people who have left those movements and who are now working to de-radicalize others. And they say there is no surefire way to draw people out, because people who are sucked into these movements instinctively do not trust experts, do not trust people who are telling them what the facts are. They've rejected that already, so why would they now believe that? And the answer is to empathize with people, to sit with them and understand what frustrations brought them to this in the first place, to this belief system, and to befriend them in such a way that they can begin to trust again. And it's really that foundation of trust that these people who've come out of those movements say was essential. They all point to one person. It could be a friend, it could be a stranger, it could be a relative, but there was always one person who connected with them, was patient with them, trusted them, and allowed them to rebuild their own trust, which is what drew them back out of the extremism.
It's such an important message, Mark, for people to hear, and especially, as I say, those folks who are seeking to understand how it is that people can be drawn into extremist groups. Marc Fisher, really eye-opening piece. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.